Faith begins where waiting ends. The first truth that must be understood is that faith is never passive. Faith is never sitting back hoping something will happen. Faith is active, deliberate, and intentional. The enemy works tirelessly to convince believers that faith is fragile, that it is something that comes and goes based on feelings or circumstances. But faith is not emotional. Faith is spiritual law. It functions whether feelings cooperate or not. Many people think they are in faith when they are actually only wishing. Wishing says, I hope God will do something. Faith says, God has already spoken, and I take Him at His word. The difference is not volume or intensity. The difference is position. Faith takes a position of agreement with what God has already said. It does not try to persuade God. It aligns itself with Him. The secret the enemy does not want revealed is that faith does not move God. Faith moves the believer into what God has already provided. God is not withholding answers, blessings, or power. He has already placed them in the realm of the Spirit. Faith is the connector. Faith reaches into the unseen and pulls it into the seen. When believers do not understand this, they keep praying prayers of request instead of prayers of belief. Faith always operates in the present tense. It does not say, I will receive. It says, I receive. The moment faith is pushed into tomorrow, it loses its authority. Tomorrow is the language of hope, not faith. Hope is good because it expects, but faith possesses. Faith does not wait for evidence. Faith creates evidence. The enemy knows that if he can keep believers looking for signs before they believe, they will never walk in victory. Faith does not follow signs. Signs follow faith. The unseen always comes before the seen. Everything God does begins in the Spirit and then manifests outwardly. When believers reverse that order, they cancel the operation of faith. This is why faith speaks. Silence is never neutral. If faith is not speaking, doubt will. Words give direction to faith. Faith does not respond to thoughts alone. It responds to confession. What is spoken consistently becomes established. The enemy fears a believer who understands the power of confession, because that believer will not talk themselves out of what God has already spoken into existence. Faith-filled words are not positive thinking. They are alignment with divine truth. When a believer says what the Word says, heaven responds. Angels move at the voice of the words spoken in faith. The enemy understands this spiritual authority, which is why he works relentlessly to keep believers speaking fear, weakness, and defeat. Faith is not denying the problem. It is denying the problem's right to rule. A believer can acknowledge symptoms, pressure, and resistance without surrendering authority to them. Faith says, I see you, but you are subject to the Word. The moment faith speaks, circumstances are placed under judgment. Another truth the enemy hides is that faith requires action. Faith that never acts is faith that never matures. Acting on the Word is the highest expression of belief. Action does not come after manifestation. Action comes after believing. Faith moves first. It steps out before the ground feels solid. It obeys before understanding every detail. Many miss miracles because they are waiting for clarity instead of acting on revelation. Faith does not need full explanation. It only needs the Word. The Word carries its own power. When acted upon, it produces results. Obedience activates faith, and faith activates results. Faith is also persistent. It does not retreat because time passes. Time is not an enemy to faith, doubt is. The enemy uses delay to pressure believers into letting go of their confession. He knows that if words change, faith weakens. Faith holds fast. It refuses to let go of what it has believed. It does not re-pray in uncertainty what it has already received by faith. When faith believes it receives, the transaction is complete in the spirit realm. Heaven records it as done. The only remaining process is manifestation. The enemy's last line of defense is discouragement during that process. He whispers that nothing is happening, that it didn't work, that God didn't hear. Faith answers those lies with the Word and stands unmoved. Faith does not grow by begging, striving, or emotional effort. Faith grows by feeding on the Word and acting on it. Every time the Word is obeyed, faith strengthens. Every time the Word is spoken, confidence increases. Faith is not fragile. It is built to endure. The enemy is not afraid of believers who know Scriptures. He is afraid of believers who act on them. Knowledge alone does not shake hell. Applied truth does. Faith that is released becomes unstoppable because it is backed by heaven's authority. When a believer understands this secret, prayer changes, words change, reactions change, fear loses influence, circumstances lose control. Faith stops being a theory and becomes a force. The believer no longer waits for God to move, but moves in agreement with what God has already declared, stands firm when pressure comes, speaks when silence would be easier, acts when logic resists, and continues believing when the natural senses see no reason to do so. Faith is not measured by intensity, but by alignment. Many believe that if they can pray harder, fast longer, or cry louder, something will shift. But faith does not respond to pressure, it responds to truth. The enemy thrives on keeping believers exhausted in effort while disconnected from revelation. Faith was never designed to be a struggle. It was designed to be a rest in what God has already spoken. The hidden truth Satan fights is that faith begins with identity before it ever touches circumstances. A believer who does not know who they are will never fully operate in faith. Faith flows from knowing position. Authority is never begged for, it is exercised. When a believer understands they are seated with Christ, faith stops trying to reach heaven and starts enforcing heaven on earth. The enemy wants believers to see themselves as outsiders trying to convince God to act. Faith sees itself as a child enforcing the will of the Father. That shift changes everything. Faith does not say, "Lord, if it be your will." Faith says, "Your will is revealed in your word, and I stand on it." Uncertainty is removed when the word is known. Faith is not activated by need, it is activated by the word. Need can create desperation, but desperation without the word produces frustration. The word produces faith, and faith produces results. Satan does not mind believers being needy. He minds them being confident. Confidence in the word dismantles fear at its root. This is why faith must be fed continually. Faith that is not fed becomes weak, not because God withdraws, but because attention shifts. Whatever dominates attention eventually dominates belief. When circumstances are magnified, faith shrinks. When the word is magnified, faith rises. The enemy understands this principle and uses distraction as a weapon. Faith operates by spiritual law, not emotional response. Feelings fluctuate, but the word remains constant. Faith does not check the atmosphere before it speaks. Faith creates the atmosphere. When believers wait to feel strong before speaking, they surrender authority to emotion. Faith speaks first and lets feelings catch up later. The enemy also fears a believer who understands that faith works through love. Guilt and condemnation are tools used to shut down faith. When a believer feels unworthy, they hesitate to stand boldly. Faith requires boldness, not because of personal perfection, but because of righteousness received. The moment a believer understands they are righteous by faith, not by works, confidence returns. Faith does not function properly under condemnation. Condemnation causes believers to look inward. Faith looks outward toward the Word. Satan accuses so that faith will hesitate. But when the believer refuses condemnation and stands on righteousness, faith flows freely. Faith also requires discipline of thought. Thoughts unchecked become beliefs. The enemy plants suggestions, not commands. Faith learns to reject thoughts that contradict the Word. A believer does not have to accept every thought that comes. Faith chooses what to agree with. Agreement gives power. Disagreement shuts the door. This is why meditation on the Word is essential. Faith grows when the Word is not only read but allowed to reshape thinking. When the Word becomes the dominant voice in the mind, faith responds naturally. Speaking the Word becomes effortless because belief has been established internally. Another truth Satan hides is that faith is released through obedience, not convenience. Faith often requires acting before understanding. Obedience is faith in motion. The enemy delays obedience by offering alternatives, reasoning, and fear of failure. But faith does not consult logic when the word has already spoken. Faith moves when the instruction is clear, even if the outcome is not. Many miracles are missed because obedience was delayed until conditions felt safe. Faith steps out while the water still looks deep. Obedience unlocks doors that faith alone has already identified. Faith also understands timing. Faith is never late. Delay does not mean denial. The enemy uses time to pressure believers into changing their confession. Faith refuses to be rushed into doubt or fear. Faith knows that what has been believed in the Spirit must eventually appear in the natural. The enemy wants believers to measure faith by speed, but faith is measured by consistency. Faith remains the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. It does not rise and fall with circumstances. It does not retreat under pressure. It holds its ground because it is grounded in the Word. When faith is understood this way, prayer changes from pleading to declaring. Words shift from hope to authority. The believer stops asking repeatedly and starts thanking confidently. Thanksgiving becomes the language of faith because it acknowledges completion before manifestation. The believer who understands this secret no longer lives at the mercy of circumstances. Faith becomes a lifestyle, not an event. Every situation becomes an opportunity to apply the Word. Every challenge becomes a platform for faith to operate. The enemy loses leverage when faith is consistent, confident, word-centered, and unshaken by what is seen, felt, or heard. Faith is governed by understanding, not desire. Desire may initiate interest, but understanding sustains faith. Many believers desire results without understanding the laws that govern faith. The enemy works diligently to keep faith mysterious, emotional, and unpredictable in the minds of believers. When faith is misunderstood, it is misused. When it is misused, it appears unreliable. But faith was never meant to be unreliable. It was meant to be consistent and dependable. The enemy's strategy has always been to separate believers from knowledge. Ignorance creates instability. Faith without knowledge becomes hope mixed with fear. True faith is informed faith. It knows what belongs to it, why it belongs to it, and how to lay hold of it. Faith does not guess, faith knows. One of the greatest secrets Satan wants hidden is that faith responds to revelation, not repetition. Saying the same thing over and over without belief does not move faith. Faith is released when revelation is received. When the Word becomes personal, faith rises automatically. Revelation produces conviction, and conviction produces action. Faith does not attempt to create truth, it responds to truth. The Word is already established. Faith simply agrees with it. Agreement is powerful because it aligns human authority with divine authority. When a believer agrees with the Word, heaven and earth come into alignment. Satan fears agreement more than effort. This is why faith must be specific. Vague faith produces vague results. Faith names what it believes for. Faith identifies promises and stands on them. General belief produces general hope, but specific faith produces specific results. The enemy thrives in vagueness because it allows doubt to coexist with belief. Faith also requires patience, not passive waiting, but active endurance. Patience is faith staying in place under pressure. The enemy uses pressure to create movement away from the Word. Faith refuses to move. It stays anchored. It does not chase alternatives. It does not negotiate with doubt. Faith understands that resistance is not failure. Resistance is often confirmation that faith is working. The enemy does not fight what is not a threat. When pressure increases, faith increases its grip on the Word. It does not loosen its hold because circumstances grow louder. Another truth the enemy hides is that faith is maintained through consistency of confession. Words are the steering wheel of faith. A believer cannot speak doubt all week and expect faith to function on demand. Faith flows where words agree with the Word. Confession is not about convincing God. It is about establishing belief in the heart. The heart believes and the mouth confirms. When the mouth contradicts the heart, confusion enters. Faith requires harmony between belief and confession. The enemy targets speech because changing words eventually changes belief. Faith guards the mouth because it values what is being produced. Faith also recognizes that what is seen is temporary, but what is believed is eternal. Circumstances are subject to change because they are not final. Faith looks beyond the surface and sees the invisible foundation of truth. The enemy wants believers trapped in the visible because the visible feels convincing. Faith knows the invisible is more real. This is why faith does not react emotionally to circumstances. Emotional reactions give circumstances power. Faith responds spiritually. It answers pressure with the word. It answers fear with truth. It answers lack with provision already declared. Faith is proactive, not reactive. Another hidden truth is that faith must be protected. Faith can be weakened by constant exposure to unbelief. The enemy uses voices, opinions, and negative reports to erode confidence. Faith chooses its influences carefully. It does not entertain what contradicts the Word. Faith grows in environments where the Word is honored. When the Word is treated lightly, faith remains shallow. When the Word is treated as final authority, faith grows strong. The enemy fears believers who treat the Word as law rather than suggestion. Faith also demands decision. Indecision is fertile ground for doubt. Faith decides and stands by that decision. Once faith is received, it does not revisit the question. Revisiting opens the door to uncertainty. Faith considers the matter settled. This is why faith refuses to keep asking for what it has already believed. Repeated asking reveals uncertainty. Faith thanks instead. Thanksgiving is not politeness, it is confidence expressed. The enemy hates thanksgiving because it signals settled faith. Faith does not grow by waiting for miracles. Faith grows by practicing the Word daily. Small acts of obedience build strong faith. Consistency in the Word produces stability in belief. Faith that is practiced becomes unshakable. When a believer understands these principles, faith stops being occasional and becomes continual. Every area of life comes under its influence. Faith shapes decisions, responses, and expectations. The enemy loses control when faith becomes a way of living rather than a tool used only in crisis. Faith stands firm, speaks boldly, believes deeply, refuses to retreat, rejects contradiction, and remains anchored in what God has already declared. Faith functions by authority, not by struggle. The greatest misunderstanding believers have is thinking faith is something they must fight to produce. Faith is not manufactured by human effort. It is received from the Word. The enemy promotes the idea that faith is rare and difficult, so believers will treat it as unreachable. But faith is accessible, practical, and designed to be used daily. The hidden truth Satan works to conceal is that faith responds instantly when it is exercised correctly. Faith does not need time to start working. It needs agreement. The moment a believer agrees with the Word, faith is activated. Delay does not mean faith has failed. It means faith is working beyond what the natural senses can detect. Faith never operates independently of authority. Authority flows from position. A believer who does not understand their authority will try to use faith like a request instead of a command. Faith speaks with authority because it speaks from truth. When faith commands, it is not being arrogant, it is being obedient to the Word. The enemy fears believers who speak with authority because authority does not negotiate. Authority does not argue with circumstances. Authority declares what must be. Faith that understands authority is calm, confident, and unmoved. It does not panic because it knows it is backed by heaven. Faith also understands that words are legal instruments in the spiritual realm. Words establish jurisdiction. Whatever a believer consistently speaks, they give permission to operate. The enemy seeks access through careless speech. Faith guards words because it understands their weight. Faith does not speak casually about serious matters. It does not joke about defeat or sickness or lack, not because it is superstitious, but because it is deliberate. Faith chooses words that agree with the Word. Agreement invites manifestation. Another truth Satan hides is that faith requires separation from fear. Fear and faith do not coexist. Fear speaks possibility of defeat. Faith speaks certainty of victory. The enemy uses fear to paralyze action. Faith neutralizes fear by acting on the word. Faith does not wait for fear to leave before acting. Acting in faith is what drives fear out. When a believer steps forward in obedience, fear loses control. Faith is strengthened every time fear is confronted and overridden by the word. Faith also understands the importance of consistency. One moment of faith does not outweigh a lifestyle of doubt. Faith grows through daily alignment with the word. What is practiced daily becomes automatic. The enemy prefers believers who operate in faith occasionally rather than consistently. Faith is also sustained by focus. Focus determines flow. What the believer focuses on will influence belief. Faith fixes its attention on the word, not on the noise of circumstances. The enemy creates noise to distract focus. Faith remains fixed. Another truth the enemy hides is that faith is proven through endurance. Endurance is faith refusing to change its confession under pressure. Pressure is designed to force compromise. Faith resists compromise by standing firm. Faith does not collapse under repetition of negative evidence. Evidence does not determine truth. Truth determines evidence. Faith holds to truth until evidence aligns. The enemy wants believers to reverse this order. Faith refuses. Faith is not blind optimism. It is informed confidence. It knows what the word says and stands on it. Faith does not hope for a good outcome. It expects the word to perform what it has promised. Expectation fuels endurance. Faith also requires humility. Humility is not weakness. It is submission to the word. Faith submits to what God has said above what is felt or seen. Pride argues. Faith submits. The enemy uses pride to keep believers reasoning instead of believing. Faith refuses to entertain alternatives once the word is clear. Alternatives create divided belief. Divided belief produces instability. Faith chooses the word and rejects competing voices. Faith does not need constant reassurance. Reassurance is the language of doubt. Faith rests in what it knows. Rest is not inactivity, it is confidence. Faith at rest is powerful because it is unmoved. Faith also recognizes that manifestation is inevitable when belief is maintained. The enemy fights maintenance more than initiation. Starting in faith is easy. Staying in faith requires discipline. Faith stays. Faith becomes unstoppable when it is rooted in identity, exercised with authority, spoken with confidence, protected by discipline, sustained by endurance, and anchored in the word. When a believer understands this, faith stops being a concept and becomes a force that governs decisions, responses, expectations, and outcomes, overriding fear, silencing doubt, and establishing what has already been declared in the spiritual realm.